So hello and welcome back to Art of Science. My name is Graham Ambrose, an assistant professor at North Carolina State University, and your host here at Art of Science, which is a quarterly interview podcast that coincides with each issue of Policy Studies Journal. And just off the bat, a reminder to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. I'm excited today. I have Annelise Russell here with me. And she is an associate professor at the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Kentucky. And she co-authored a paper with Alison Craig, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. And in this past issue, Drs. Russell and Craig published a research note entitled "Information is Cheap, but Filtering is Costly: Congressional Investment in Reference Resources." And just quickly at a high level, Drs. Russell and Craig examine how freshman members of the House invest to help them filter information, examining the newness in this political arena against other attributes like political party, staff spending, and their introduction of bills in that year. While the authors explore these factors, they argue that investing in reference material and news media provides insight into congressional agendas, offers political context, and prioritizes issues of importance, combating the problems of information processing and bounded rationality. So with that, I just want to thank Annelise for being here today. And with that, to start off, would you mind digging in a little bit deeper to this publication?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Anytime I get to talk about what Congress does and why, and then I get to talk about the sort of media and comms flavor of it. It's such a treat for me. But this paper, in a lot of public policy process vein, asks how do policymakers know what's going on, and how do they filter all the information coming in? Because we know that policymakers, they've got information coming in sort of rapidly and sort of a full fire hose, right? This is coming from constituents. This is coming from policy advocates. This is coming from think tanks, right? There is no lack of information for a policymaker and their staff to consume. But one of the things you have to consider, right, is what do we do with this sort of bottleneck, right? How do we deal with the fact that we could pay attention to all of these things, but there's only so much, right, an office can actually grapple with, right? And there are a lot of tools that an office has or that a policymaker has to be able to sort of adapt to that sort of policy environment. But one of the things that we think is critical to that is the role that media and news play in providing both policy information, context, and sort of helping with that filtering that inevitably has to happen. And so this article dives into what members of Congress spend, right? Diving into their disbursements to understand how they invest in a category that's called sort of publications and reference material, which covers a wide range, but oftentimes it's those investments in news media, it's those investments in policy information, things like Bloomberg or Politico Pro, where you're not just getting, right, the Wall Street Journal, which some members are paying for, and that's in this, but also sort of that elevated insider news, like very niche, right? What's going on today, and what is the latest information tracking policy, not just sort of those big salient topics, but right, if we think about sort of outside of macro politics, what's happening in those policy subsystems, sort of at this meso and micro level, to be able to really understand, right, what the institution is doing and what these policy communities are paying attention to. And so by looking at those and looking at what policymakers are investing in, what we find is that outside of a lot of typical explanations for congressional behavior, right? We talk about polarization and partisanship. What we find is sort of the best explainer or most closely associated with these investment behaviors in media and publications is their tenure in office, given that new members don't necessarily know the lay of the land. They're less familiar with that policy environment. They have to sort of quickly become accustomed to the norms and the way the information flows within the institution. And one way we argue that that can be done is through these investments. And so what we see, particularly for those first term policymakers, is they're investing in these reference and publication materials more than other or more senior lawmakers who sort of mitigate that bottleneck of attention that I talked about earlier elsewhere or through any number of other mechanisms. And so with this paper, we really, I think it does a couple things. One, it sort of brings to light that this is something that policymakers are using to sort of navigate a policy environment with lots of inputs, but also sort of highlights the role of media and communication within a world in which we understand the policy and the legislative piece of it all. But right, it's a lot more integrated than we think about. And so the role that media can play not only in providing news and information, but also context to the policy world in which they're operating, and context sort of how a member can see themselves within that policy environment.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I have to admit up front that I found this article really fascinating, but it's something that I don't know much about. So just to kind of delve into that last point that you made, I thought it was interesting, and you talk about these kind of three streams, right? So you talk about insight from media that's getting into the congressional agenda, to the kind of political context, and to prioritization of issues. And also how that information from media is coming from different sources, as you also alluded to. Could you just kind of speak a little bit more about those kind of two different dynamics of like what information and from what sources?
Yeah. So I mean, we can think about this, and right, it's sort of like, here's a pie. How many ways do you want to slice it? But I think the way in this case that's at least most intuitive for me is if we think about this sort of in three buckets. And this is sort of how we break this down sort of in the paper, sort of why this investment, why this information filtering is important, in the sense that accepting the assumption that information is abundant, right, is that one, this investment can provide details about the policy agenda, right? What are the issues that people are paying attention to, right? What is going on in this weird institution? Because right, if you don't intimately understand Congress, it feels very complex and weird, and it's got a lot of rules that no one knows anything about. And for at least a lot of my students, they find it just like the most obtuse institution ever, trying to figure out, why do we do things that way? And members themselves, when even if they've had prior lawmaking experience, whether that be at like the state or local level, it's still its own political reality. And so trying to figure out, okay, what is the institution doing? What's going on? The second piece of this is sort of like the context around it, right? The political world of like, okay, so we know that Congress is doing this. Why does this matter? What does this mean, right? So if a budget's proposed, right, what does that mean? What are my next steps? Where are we going from here, right? What are the implications of all these choices, right? Because for every action, there's 50,000 reactions, right? So who are the winners and the losers when we address this, right? All of this is pertinent information beyond just, right, the X's and O's, right? It's sort of, okay, what's the rest of the arena look like? And then sort of the third bucket that I think is really interesting is also this investment allows them to track sort of their own impact and their own name and their own reputation within this ecosystem, right? So they're looking for information, they're looking for context, but they're also looking to see like where they're fitting in, right? Because one of the big things that offices do is they collect every media mention about their member, right? Like, how are we getting talked about? Who's talking about us? In what context, right? And that information gets used in any number of ways. But it's important to know sort of where you fit into this bigger puzzle, right? Even beyond sort of the sort of representation piece and the ephemera of presentation. It's okay. Where is my reputation policy-wise being solidified, and how do I fit into this larger puzzle? So those are sort of like the three ways that we see sort of obvious implications for how this information gets used or can be used by, a policymaker and their office.
Yeah, and I guess the flip side of this, because you show this in your paper, where there is just a drastic drop, right? After that first term, even in the second term, you see this kind of large drop. And you talk about it a little bit in the paper, but could you discuss kind of what gets substituted in replacement of that investment?
Yeah, so I mean, it's different, right? It's not necessarily right a one-for-one trade-off necessarily,
Mhm.
but right there are a lot of ways in which an office can then turn to other things, right? Some of this is just being there for long enough to know, oh, maybe I don't need this anymore. Or like when you're a new member, everyone comes to tell you, oh, you're gonna need this and this and this and this. It's kind of like when you're a new parent, right? And you're trying to figure out, okay, what do I need as a first-time parent for a new kid, right? And you get all of the things, right? And you get all the goodies, and then you realize, like, crap, I didn't use half of that stuff because I was too worried about, when my baby eats and poops. And those are the only things I'm concerned about. And to a certain extent, being a new lawmaker is similar. You get all the bells and whistles or things you think you might need. And then you learn as you go along, okay, maybe we don't need that. So that's sort of one way we get that, attenuation after the first term. There's also the fact that, you have new staff. Some offices are really lucky and they get to hire senior staff, right? If you're replacing a long-term lawmaker of the same party, oftentimes a lot of those senior folks will join your office, and so you can benefit from that institutional knowledge. But for a lot of members, they don't have that institutional knowledge. And so this is, one way. If they build it over time, maybe they don't need as much in terms of reference material and resources. And then some of this is just sort of the intangibles, right? As a lawmaker, you know what you need to know, and that's enough, right? To a certain extent, there are lawmakers that have been there 20, 30 years, and they themselves have been there long enough. They know more about the dynamics around agricultural policy than any reporter in the world could tell them, right? So a good example of this is someone like in the Senate, like Jack Reed, when it comes to Veterans Affairs. He's been on this committee for so long. He knows this ins and out. Like, to a certain extent, he doesn't need to read Politico Pro to know what's going to happen in terms of veterans policy, right? So some of this, is part of, what the lawmaker, as far as their policy portfolio, what they build over time, and, and how vast that policy portfolio is.
Good. So switching gears a little bit here, right? So I'm just curious, where did the ideas for this paper come from?
Yeah. Oh boy. So this is a great question. As I start to think, I was like, how far back should I really go to answer this? Right? Because both Alison and I think come to, and I'm going to just speak for her, and she can yell at me about the answer for this later. With sort of an on-the-ground perspective of understanding Congress. I was there briefly as a reporter. She worked for a long time in a House member's office. And so a lot of the work that I think we both do is trying to sort of align what we know from an academic sense with those realities that we experienced or continue to experience in different ways today. Sort of this, what's actually going on in an office versus sort of the, how do we understand the bigger picture and where it fits in. And so I think in that same vein is sort of where this paper comes from, right? On a sort of a micro level sense, I was looking at House disbursements. They're atrocious, and this is the last time we will spend time probably looking at House disbursements. But also the reality of there are a lot of things about Congress that we don't think about readily. And so from the Congress crowd, if we think about disbursements, usually we're looking at things like salaries, right? How much are we spending, sort of top line things. Very few people that I know of, if anyone, have ever thought, ooh, that reference category is really interesting. Well, now there are at least two of us, so hi. And so it was trying to figure out how does this get used? What does that variation look like over time? And sort of thinking about all of this. We have a lot of congressional data, but there's still things that we don't know as much about. And right, this comms and this type of information is one we know a little bit less of. And I love a problem that other people haven't tackled before. So I think this paper sort of comes out of that vein of trying to sort of tackle congressional questions that other people haven't thought are important, and then sort of blending those understandings with what we know from the policy process and what we know sort of policy making sort of writ large, and where those two sort of reality and theoretics align.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just kind of digging in a little bit further there, there's certainly a part there about kind of your own experiences, right?
Yeah.
There's a part about kind of knowing the field, knowing the subfield, where there's maybe holes in the questions,
Yeah.
research gaps. I'm curious. You brought up the fact that people care about the spending, but people don't look at that research or the reference in media component. Where did the realization or like the idea of like digging into something or that kind of corner of those investment fund reporting come from? And can you just talk a little bit more about that kind of specific corner?
Yeah. So I mean, I think some of that, sort of to take it back further, comes from the fact that the things that I think about that are interesting about Congress are very rarely the things that anyone else thinks are interesting. So, right, back when I started my PhD back in 2012, I had the radical idea that Twitter was a useful mechanism for understanding policy agendas, right? And we can debate whether that's still true on X today. But there is not a wine portion of the interview, so we'll save that for another day. But, right, so it's this idea that there are policy signals out there around Congress that that we can use to offer some leverage when it comes to agenda setting and lawmaker behavior. And typically, we're really good at understanding legislative outputs, right? Like, the Policy Agendas Project does a phenomenal job of understanding how legislative outputs and executive outputs map on to policy topics and being able to measure those over time. And the Congress Scholarship does a great job at understanding rules and committees and legislative process. Where I think we've often faltered is thinking about those other parts of policymaking that are central to government, but we don't think of as readily, right? And I think internal dynamics within an office is one of those things that Alison's very good at addressing in her research. And then from my perspective, it's often things like communication and media that we don't readily assess with politics or policy as often, that provide us with useful information to understand how our government works and how it operates. So I think it sort of continues in this vein of finding things that people or colleagues in policy and in Congress would otherwise skip, but that we often think are essential to understanding the institution.
And just to kind of bridge to kind of statements that you made prior, thinking about seeing those gaps that you're talking about, but also apparently the data is really messy, right? It maybe wasn't what you're hoping for. Can you just talk about matching those questions or gaps that you are seeing, and then digging into the data and realizing, well, this is what's actually here. And if that process in itself ended up changing the questions that you guys had.
Yeah. So I don't think the sort of any data issues redirected the questions. But I remember going through this and sort of showing Allison what I'd done, and I think she was just like, "Oh, Annelise, no, we've got to spend some more time looking here." And so I will say, sort of writ large, whenever you're looking at congressional disbursement data, I think the thing to keep in mind, and the thing that makes it sometimes messy, is that all of this data is self-reported, right? There isn't some sort of higher, like, overarching umbrella that collects this information and ensures its accuracy, right? Congressional offices are tasked with reporting all of this. And so there's variation in reporting, right? There's imperfect data that gets reported. And particularly for those who study things like staff salaries and sort of other much more variable information, those are the people doing real hero work. I at least was looking for a standard, like, line item that was at least fairly consistent. But I think that's a universal problem, in the sense of when we're doing work. And I come from the tradition of, we look for fun data sets, we build data sets, we build up data sets. Is right. That's part of the process, is understanding what good data is, how to improve that data, and what level of sort of data messiness you will accept. Because I deal with also things like Twitter data. That's not clean data by any means. And so you have to figure out, okay, at what point can I get it as good as I think it is? And at least, okay, even if it's not perfect, it's consistent, right? So I'm not contributing to the problem. And so I think this, in the scheme of sort of big data, this is a relatively small sort of set that we were dealing with, intentionally so. But it's putting to practice all of those sort of data skills that we all learn at some point, and then have to sort of deploy at different points, when what you think is going to be, that's going to be straightforward, and then realize not so much.
Would you mind kind of digging into those skills a little bit more? I know in policy process, especially as a young scholar, you're kind of told to get out and find your own data, construct your own data, and there's value in that. But can you talk about, like, those guide rails, or those kind of methods or skills that you're alluding to?
Yes. So I was in graduate school. I was a Brian Jones student at the University of Texas, where we were dealing with large data sets, hand coding lots of things, trying to be as accurate as possible, right? Sort of back when I started grad school, the world of automation and AI looked very different than it does today. But so I think there were a couple sort of things we always were to keep in mind. Right. And one of those, particularly when we're coding or when we're making data decisions, it's that the most important decision isn't the decision to be right or wrong, right? It's the decision to be consistent, right? And I think that's one of the biggest data lessons I've learned over time, is that it's not just about whether you decided this row in a CSV represented numbers 1, 2, or 3, right? It's whether or not that row and rows like it will always represent a 1, 2, or 3, right? And that is sort of the biggest, I think, data lesson that I employ in the work that I do, and then I employ with my students, in the sense that you can always defend the choice that you make, but you can't defend sporadic choices. You can't defend the fluctuation. You can have consistent data, and consistent data is just as important as accurate data. It sounds sort of strange when I say it that way, but that was one of the sort of biggest lessons that I learned. And it's in the sense that it's not just about whether or not you're right or wrong. It's about doing it consistently over time, particular when you're dealing with long time series. And that has always been sort of a through line in the work that I do. I think other things that that this sort of reflects when it comes to data is being mindful of the realities of policymaking and making sure the data reflects that. So thinking about how we match data with our knowledge of institutions on the ground. So Congress has a lot of data, policymaking institutions have a lot of data. Um, but that data stems from something. It stems from people on the ground making decisions. And so I think there's also a mindfulness that, as we take advantage of the data that institutions produce, we also have to understand those institutions beyond just the data that they provide. And so I think this project stems from that appreciation of understanding what happens in a congressional office and how that reporting happens, and what it means to actually be buying Politico Pro and what that provides you with the data that we can then manipulate quantitatively. And I think that's really important, particularly when you're studying something like Congress, where there is a lot of nuance. It's very complex. And so being able to match what you find quantitatively with the realities of the institution, I think is also really important.
Yeah, I just really appreciate that because I think we often deal with such messy data, right? So it's something that we inherently have to deal with. But especially with AI and computation becoming more and more on the forefront of a lot of our research, or in the kind of research sphere in general, we can't forget the second part, right? Like we still need to be the experts and understand that process to make sure that the information coming out, if it's computational or coded or whatever, that it fundamentally makes sense to the process that we know it's coming from. We as kind of scholars and experts are still kind of fundamental in that role.
Yeah, absolutely.
Switching gears again a little bit here. So you were a part of a research note, which is a newer format at PSJ. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about writing in that format, it being a little bit shorter, more concise. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I consider myself really lucky in that within the discipline of public policy and political science, the opportunity to do short articles or research notes sort of come along in the last 5 years or so. And I found this really helpful because I come out of a tradition that I was taught, you make one point and you write a paper. But sometimes the point you want to make isn't theoretically like foundational. You're not sort of reevaluating these sort of big things, but maybe you have a new data set, right, that makes us think a little bit about our priors, or maybe you have considered a new independent variable that forces us to think differently about the outcomes we've already measured before, or maybe you're testing a theory in a different venue. And certainly you could write a full paper about it, but it doesn't necessarily, more words is not actually going to make it any stronger, right? Coming from a journalism background, like the fewest words and being able to convey your point succinctly is so powerful. And so being able to do that in an academic sense, I find really, really helpful, because there is a lot of work that I think all of us do where we are doing a bigger project maybe, and you find, oh, that's a really interesting finding. I'm not really sure where it fits. It fits in a research note or a short article. And sort of this is indicative of a bunch of the different notes that I've done over the last few years. Reviewers and editors, right, are still trying to figure out what is that sweet spot, what is a note versus what's not a note, right? Trying to figure out how to signal what our expectations for it are. And inevitably that's how long is a piece of string? But But I've really found it useful in sort of forcing me to be very direct with what I mean, right? With a long article, I can sort of go all over the place and cover all of the potentially relevant literature, but it's also really easy for that narrative to become sort of a winding road. You can't get off track in a short article because you don't have the room to do so. And so when you're trying to make a point, I think a short article can be really helpful because it forces you to do so in a limited space, very efficiently, very quickly. Um, and and I think it's okay to I think we should be able to sort of chase down these interesting findings that for a long time we just sort of like, okay, well, maybe I'll write a book chapter someday and I'll include that there. But but having a space to really share that with the academic community, and at least for me, I've had just as much positive responses and reactions to short articles that I've written as to write books that I've published. So that's been really helpful for me, and I think it's also really helpful for young scholars. Right, we have this publish or perish mindset, and sort of being able to put together short things while you're working on bigger projects. I think is strategically advantageous. And so while there is, again, some uncertainty about how short articles work and what that process looks like, at least for me, it's been a really sort of rewarding investment to at least sort of navigate those new hurdles.
Yeah, and speaking of young scholars, do you have any advice for young scholars that are building out specific ideas or specific research projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, one, it looks so much different today than it did when I was a young scholar, but I think there are some through lines that, regardless of what you're doing, um, I would say you have to be your own best advocate, right? Like the things that you find interesting, um, if you find them interesting, then you need to stick to your guns and work on interesting topics, right? It's not what your advisor thinks is interesting or what you think other people will think are interesting. um, you have to spend a lot of solitary time with your thoughts, right? And so being committed to the work that you're doing, um, figuring out how you want to identify as a scholar. I face this in the sense of I got asked very early on, right? Like, are people only going to think of you, right, as the Congress Twitter person? And I was like, ooh, maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe I should diversify. But it turned out to be the best gift I ever got, because if anyone thinks, oh, I wonder what like in the context of these two things, most of the time someone's going to say, oh, well, maybe we should ask Annelise, right? Like, so I think there's something to be said for, like, if you find a nail that you just absolutely that hits for you, like, you should not feel bad about that, and that's what you should be investing your time in. The other piece of advice, I think, and I think this is where this paper comes from, is as a young person, putting yourself out there to network with other scholars, even if they don't exactly do what you do, right? The reason, sort of my origin story for getting to work with Alison on this project, was we both, as graduate students, attended a Women in Methodology conference. And we met, and I just thought she was a lovely human. She was working on different things, but we were sort of both interested in Congress. In a funny turn of events, she got hired at the University of Texas my last year of grad school, and right, and we've been friends ever since. And then at some point, we're like, we should write an article together, right? This aligns with both of our worlds, and I think so much of my career has been finding people who I like to work with, finding people who I can collaborate with, going and sort of putting myself out there, even though I'm like the most introverted person imaginable. Like, I think it's, and right, our policy communities are so much kinder than other communities that I've been a part of, that, that sort of finding those other partners, particularly as a junior scholar, pays off, right? I met Allison 10 years ago, right? So like, it's, And then, so right, like 9 years later, we published an article together. Cool. Like I could never have imagined that at the time, but I think it's those investments that you make as a junior scholar that in the long run pay off years later.
Yeah, I think that has been the most kind of common thread through all of the kind of podcast episodes is first networking, but also like the type of networking, right? This kind of um, not kind of super like as a business, like very
No, I
strategic.
never had, like, I guess I don't hand out business cards.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing is like you hear about all these collaborators that come on, and it's this conversation of just like, the right person made the right introduction at the right time, or, we happen to be at the same conference together, or kind of these intangible
Yeah.
um, things, and then taking advantage of those relationships over time. I think that's kind of one of the coolest things that I've seen over these episodes is that truly is such like a through line between people's conversations.
Yes. Well,
Um,
and I will say, like, on that, right, that thread, even if, right, just showing up at a conference and talking to someone gives you great anxiety, it gives me great anxiety. The best piece of advice I got, and I still do this to a certain extent, is every conference, every sort of group I go to, I send an email to one person, typically a senior scholar, that I would like to meet. And I send just one and I say, hey, I'm a fan of your work. I would love to chat with you more. Would you be willing to get coffee? And for a number of years, I've done this, and it forced me to have conversations with people I might not otherwise. And I don't know if I've ever collaborated with any of those people, but it put me out there, right? It helped develop my network. I got better at talking to strangers, frankly. And it's sort of those like little things that you can do if it doesn't come naturally for you, to sort of not force yourself to do it, but give you tools to be able to do those things that for some people can be really difficult.
yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. I guess to kind of dig in a little bit more, because you talked about kind of reaching out to those scholars or meeting those scholars, and you also talked about 9 years later, that relationship you started has now turned into a paper, right? Can you just talk a little bit more about maybe what that relationship was like, and now eventually it's turned into a paper, but just talking a little bit more about your collaboration with Allison.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, in all honesty, what began over a glass of wine and still continues to this day to be a friendship over a glass of wine. Inevitably, we put the wine glass down and wrote something. Um, but I think that's the thing I enjoy most about my job is I write. I mean, I do some things on my own, but increasingly, most of the work I do is collaborative. A, because the questions and the data we're dealing with today are just so much for one person to deal with that that doesn't sound enjoyable. I genuinely like the people I work with, and the people I work with become my friends, and people who I do build friendships with. I realize we work well together regardless of the topic that's at hand, finding people you write well with, finding people whose skills match yours, right? Allison is a methods wizard, and that's not my strong suit, but I could write an introduction um, every day if I had to. I love coming up with a way to start a story, and I think Allison would rather not do that. So finding people who complement what you do is also a real treat. And so I think some of that is just embracing the fact that I love this job and I love the people that I've met along the way, and finding people who are willing to collaborate and collaborate over and over again um, is one of the best parts of this job. Like very rarely do I collaborate with someone and I'm like, okay, well that was fun, bye. Right? It's okay. What are we doing next? Right? What's the next thing? And this is sort of gets back to this short article thing. Inevitably, you come up with this idea, you want to work on something, and it could go in any number of 3 ways. And you say, okay, great, let's pick the one that we're going to start with. But we know that we've got these 2 other things that we'd like to try. And even if they're not a full paper, we've already run like 2/3 of the way. Let's just finish running it down for these other 2 things. And so I think it makes that experience even more feasible, because you've got people to share the load, and then once when you're trying to figure out, okay, where are we on this paper, I can just text someone and say, hi, your friendly nag here, but what's up, what's going on? And so that's also been sort of the benefit of working with those people who you build friendships with along the way.
So you spent some time reflecting on kind of your younger years as a
Oh,
scholar.
yes.
But I'm curious if you could give advice to a younger version of yourself. What advice would that be?
Oh boy. I think part of it is probably what everyone says. You're doing fine. You're doing great. Keep going. All of that uncertainty, that was normal. Um, but trying to think. Um, I think confidence, right? Being confident in a space, in a room, took time. Uh, being assertive when I do know something, and rather than being deferential, um, I think that would have been better. And I think just sort of taking care of oneself along the way. Right? Like this is not an easy endeavor, right? And so rather being our own worst critics, we also have to be, and there's no way to get around that, but we also have to be our own best cheerleaders. And I think that's something that I'm not unique in learning that, you know, a little later than that might have been desired.
I guess I'm curious if there's any kind of specific moments that spurred that change, those transitions from just having a little bit more confidence, or um, you know, maybe
Getting a job really helps.
sure, sure.
Oh, I mean, I will say, so the first article that I had published, I have this strong memory of like, okay, maybe I can actually do this.
Hmm.
I was in my kitchen in my apartment in Austin, Texas, and it was like 10 a.m. And I got the email that my article had been accepted. And I'm pretty sure either I opened a bottle of wine and started dancing, um, or, you know, Flip It started dancing. And then because I think there's this light switch that goes on, okay, I can do this. I'm sort of I exist in this space. I finally sort of figured it out. And I don't know if I actually had, but I think those are those external sort of like, yes, you can do this, right? They're not required, but for me those were the moments that I was like, oh yeah, yes, I've what I'm doing, other people agree that it is at least worthy in some way, and I will continue to do this. And then also I think just having people around you too, that remind you that what you're doing matters. And you know I think even in like my later years, right? A couple years ago I gave a lecture at the Library of Congress, and those are like sort of pinch me moments where you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I got to do this. That you can't, that we're quick to forget those moments, but I think sort of leave lasting impressions that what we do matters.
Yeah, and I feel like advice that I got is that you work so hard, and then the gratification is often so delayed, right? Like even the work that you put into getting that paper published, or how much work you put in to then be invited to that talk. Um, we live in a world that it's so much work, and it's kind of fleeting moments of delayed gratification. But it's true. I can imagine, or I can remember the same place that I was when my first paper was accepted too. So um, it is those moments of like, oh, somebody thinks it's good enough, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, great. I guess to kind of come up on the hour here, are there any kind of concluding thoughts that you would like to share?
Ooh, I mean, I think just sort of reinforcing that um, there's so much about the policy process and the way our governing institutions work that we don't know, or that we still have so much to better understand. Um, right, I encourage junior scholars and people who are considering going down this path that, right, it's not an easy one, but there's still lots of questions that go unanswered, um, lots of data to be sorted through. Um, that sticking with it and being your best advocate um, is worth it in the long run. Um, you know, I can't think of a job I would rather do. If you can think of a job you'd rather do, you should go do that job. But I can't think of one. And if that's your same answer, then I think there's a policy community that will always be welcoming.
Great. So I just want to say thank you, Annelise, for spending the last hour with us. I really appreciate it, taking some time out of your busy schedule to chat with me and hopefully our listeners that'll be listening soon. Um, Again, if you are listening, just a reminder to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Additionally, follow us at Art of Science Pod on Twitter. And I just want to say thanks both to the Policy Studies Journal as well as the Center for Policy Design and Governance at Syracuse University, through which this podcast is a joint initiative. So with that, again, thank you. I appreciate the time that you've spent with us, and I'll see our listeners next quarter.